Hello, and welcome back to the CASI series on the fundamentals of competition with China. In this video, we will look at how the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, exercises authority and direction over its forces to accomplish a mission. Because command and control, or C2 for short, can be a loaded term at times, let us narrow our focus to three specific questions. Who commands forces in the PLA? Where do certain command elements have authority? And how do those command elements exercise authority over subordinate forces? We will also explore some unique C2 cases in the PLA, namely C2 of nuclear, space, and network operations. Let us look first to who commands. To understand who commands what in the PLA, we need to look at what types of authorities exist and the levels of authority across the PLA. Understanding the types of authority within the PLA is not hard. The PLA has a very similar set of authorities compared to the United States. In fact, they draw specific parallels between their command authorities and those found in the US military. The five types of a command authority that support the PLA are 1. Operational command authority, which is roughly analogous to the US's combatant command authority. 2. Centralized control authority, which is roughly analogous to the US's operational control authority. 3. Task control authority, analogous to the US's tactical control authority. 4. Support authority, similar to the US's support authority. And 5. Coordinate authority, which is like the US's coordinate authority. The PLA's operational command authority allows for an entity to issue orders and direct forces, organize forces and subordinate command elements, establish command relationships for subordinate units, organize unit training, direct logistics and equipment support, appoint and dismiss subordinate commanders in a wartime, and issue operational requirements. The next level of authority is what the PLA calls centralized control authority. This provides a commanding entity with the authority to issue orders and direct forces, organize subordinate forces, and execute operations within a defined time or mission scope. However, entities with centralized control authority do not have the authorities over administrative functions regarding personnel, training, and logistics. Down one more level is the task control authority. This is nearly identical to the US's tactical control or TACON authority. In a task control authority command relationship, the commanding element can issue specific tasks and plans, but does not have the ability to reorganize those forces or deal with administrative or logistics matters. Next, we have the support authority. Once a command element establishes a support command authority between two units, the supported unit can issue tasks and operational requirements to the supporting unit. The PLA generally categorizes support in several ways. The first is direct versus indirect, based on the closeness of the support. For example, an Air Force unit providing close air support to a ground combat unit would be an example of direct support, whereas an Air Force unit attacking enemy ground targets far from the supported ground combat unit, but still in support of that ground combat unit's mission, would be indirect support. The PLA also clarifies that support can come in the form of intelligence, additional forces of the same type, fires, logistics, and administrative support. Lastly, we had the coordinate authority. This command relationship is intended to strengthen cooperation between two parallel units and accomplish their respective tasks. Inherently, the units must be of the same seniority and must be trying to accomplish similar tasks. This command relationship can either be a mutual relationship wherein both units are equal partners, or a relationship wherein one unit is the primary actor. Bearing in mind that the types of authorities that exist in the PLA, let us now look to the levels of force within the PLA and what command authorities they have. At the very top is the Central Military Commission, or CMC for short. We will go into more details about the CMC in our organization and personnel video, but as a recap, the CMC is the senior-most decision-making body for the military in the PRC. The CMC likely conducts strategic-level military decision-making through consensus of CMC members, although the CMC chairman, currently CCP Secretary General Xi Jinping, likely has a greater, if not final, say. Not surprisingly, the CMC almost certainly reserves the right to exercise direct control over tactical formations, although this is likely also the case for some command elements beneath the CMC. Oversight of day-to-day operations is almost certainly the responsibility of a designated duty officer running the CMC's Joint Operations Command Center. It's unclear what authorities that duty officer in charge has versus what requires approval from the full CMC, but it is safe to assume that should something unexpected occur, the duty officer would have a set of predetermined authorities which would allow for an immediate response, rather than forcing the PLA to idly wait for the CMC to convene and determine a course of action. The next level of force is the theater level. This consists of the PLA's theater commands, functional commands, and service headquarters. These entities all likely have some variation of operational command authority, or COCOM authority in US parlance. The PLA's 4 service headquarters, specifically the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force, likely play little role in the command and control of operations. In the PLA's post-reform era, these entities mostly filled a man, train, and equip role. In other words, they are the force providers to the theater commands. That being said, they may not be entirely removed from the operational side of things. Soon after the PLA stood up the theater command structure, there were still some indications that the Navy and Air Force still played a role in overseeing operational activities. However, there has been little indication of continued service headquarters involvement in operations since at least 2020. The PLA currently exercises C2 over operations through the theater command structure. As discussed in the PLA organization and personnel video, the PLA's 5 theater commands are aligned against land and, where applicable, maritime security challenges in their respective geographic areas around China's periphery. Given that mission, each theater command has operational command authority over most forces within their theater and operations in their strategic direction. For example, the Eastern Theater Command has the authority to plan and execute operations related to Taiwan, oversee joint training within its area of responsibility, and organize subordinate forces to meet regional security challenges. Under each theater command is a theater army, a theater air force, and for theaters with maritime areas of responsibility, a theater navy. There's also a theater subordinate rocket force command, although they are not called theater rocket forces. These theater service component commands exercise centralized control authority, or OPCON in US parlance, over forces assigned by the theater command. These entities likely act in a similar fashion as US Combatant Command service components. For example, the Eastern Theater Command Air Force is to the Eastern Theater Command as PACAF is to Indo-PACOM. Similarly, the Eastern Theater Command Air Force Commander acts as the Theater Command Air Operations Group Commander, just as the PACAF Commander often will serve as the Indo-PACOM Joint Forces Air Component Commander. Sometimes the PLA may opt to establish an additional level of force at the sub-theater command level, again, similar to the US's approach to sub-theater level components. These sub-theater commands likely have task control authorities, support authorities, and coordinating authorities with relevant units. In the PLA, these will likely be standing or temporary command elements assigned to oversee operations that are smaller in span or scope than a full theater, or when there are highly dynamic operations involved. For example, the PLA has a standing sub-theater component for defensive operations around China's periphery, as well as one specifically for operations occurring in the PRC's East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone. Now that we understand levels of force and what authorities each level has, let us move on to where they command forces. Each theater command has a specific area of responsibility built around a strategic direction. The Eastern Theater Command covers Japan, the East China Sea, and Taiwan. They also appear to have some responsibility for some portion of the Western Pacific beyond the first island chain. The Southern Theater Command oversees Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and a large swath of the Western Pacific as well as Indian Ocean. The Western Theater Command's area of responsibility covers South and Central Asia, as well as China's border with India. The Northern Theater Command is responsible for areas bordering Russia, Korea, the Yellow Sea, and the Sea of Japan. And lastly, we have the Central Theater Command that exercises C2 over forces around the Beijing capital region and central China. Below the theater commands, there are several regionally focused sub-theater elements. The most notable of these sub-theater elements is a joint command assigned to oversee operations in the East China Sea. Called the East China Sea Joint Operations Command Subordinate, it is subordinate to, although it predates, the Eastern Theater Command. This command element likely exists due to the highly fluid and sensitive nature of China's territorial dispute with Japan over parts of the East China Sea. This has been predominantly a Navy-led, but is ostensibly a joint command that likely has task control and support authorities over select Eastern Theater Command units, as delegated by the Eastern Theater Command. To oversee regional defensive operations, the PLA has several base commands. As a quick note, in the PLA as a whole, they use the term base with a capital B to indicate an organizational structure. These may in fact include a number of physical locations, aka bases with a small b. The operational bases that we are talking about here today are big B organizational structure bases. These PLA bases exercise C2 over basic defensive operations in the air and sea domain that do not require the full attention of the theater. These bases likely have a blend of select operational command authorities in that they also exercise limited administrative and logistics functions over organic forces assigned to them. But these bases also exercise command functions to oversee coastal defense missions within their area of responsibility. Defense of China's littoral areas is controlled by 8 coastal defense bases: Lushun, Qingdao, Shanghai, Fuzhou, Guangzhou, Yulin, and Nansha. These coastal defense bases report to a theater command navy and exercise limited centralized control authorities in defending China's claimed maritime space, predominantly within the first island chain, although some evidence suggests that they are pushing that boundary outwards. Defense of China's airspace is managed through a similar structure of air defense bases. Shanghai, Fuzhou, Nanning, Kunming, Lanzhou, Lhasa, Urumqi, Dalian, Jinan, Datong, and Wuhan that report to Theater Command Air Forces. These air defense bases have limited centralized control authorities to oversee the defense of designated airspace regions within and around China. A noteworthy exception in the C2 of air defense is that the PLA Navy likely acts as a supported element in air defense of the South China Sea, with the PLA Air Force being the supporting element. This is because there are no PLAF integrated air defense systems in the region, and the plan operates virtually all fixed-wing assets in the region. One might notice at this point that the geography of the PLA's C2 is very China-centric. This is very much a function of the PLA's intent to fight a home game. As such, the boundaries between theater commands have unique characteristics. For example, the boundary between the Eastern and Northern Theater Commands is somewhere near the 35 North line, and the line between the Eastern and Southern Theater Commands is this line south of the Taiwan Strait. However, the PRC-centric boundaries become less clear the further away you get from PRC territory. For example, how far out does the Eastern and Northern Theater Command line go? Does the 35 North line run until it hits California? And how far south does the Southern Theater Command line go? Does it encompass the entire Southern Pacific? Unfortunately, we simply don't have enough data to make an educated estimate. The best guess we have, based on what information is available, is that the second island chain acts as the eastern boundary for theater-level operations, and the eastern Indian Ocean acts as the western boundary for theater-level maritime operations. What is more certain is that these boundaries will likely expand as the PLA becomes more comfortable with operations further from China. So how does each level of force exercise authorities within their assigned areas of responsibility? For decades, the PLA has invested heavily in a suite of command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or C4ISR systems. And since 2016, it has worked diligently to stand up an institutional system that is capable of exercising C2 over modern joint operations. On the C4ISR system side, we can't get into that much detail at the unclassified level. But what we can at least provide is a broad brush understanding of where the PLA is today. All command decisions made at each level of force is to be informed by both qualitative analysis and quantitative calculations. To meet that requirement, command staff at the sub-theater and above level have access to a wide array of command decision-making aids that help make calculations regarding assessed enemy disposition, predicted loss exchange ratios, necessary force disposition, and shot allocation. The technical specifics of how these command decision-making aids work, where they get their data from, and the algorithms behind them are obviously not available to us. But with the PLA's embracing of information and automation as keys to winning wars, a command element's ability to quickly process vast amounts of information is increasingly reliant on algorithms versus people. That being said, these command decision-making aids are not intended to replace human decision-making. They simply provide the command staff with the best information possible on which they can base a human decision. To transmit information across units and commands, the PLA continues to build out an extensive communications network with multiple redundancies in place. Through a combination of space-based, troposcatter, VHF and UHF, hardwired, commercial, and even obsolescent communication systems, the PLA has built a network designed to pass information to wherever it may be needed. Many of these communication nodes are hardened against both kinetic and electromagnetic attacks. Notably, most of the PLA's fiber optics network is dug in and protected with limited concrete lining, and above-ground nodes are protected against electromagnetic pulses. This ensures that even in the face of adversary fires, the PLA can still retain sufficient communications across the force. Feeding into this communication network is a huge network of ISR sensors. Hundreds, if not thousands, of space-based ISR platforms, ground-based radars, passive detection systems, and weapons platforms feed into the broader information network using the PLA's Joint Information Distribution System and other data links to create a common operating picture. This data is then passed across the force to tactical formations and command elements alike. Of course, all of this hardware is useless if there is not an institutional system in place to translate that data into actionable information. At the center of the CMC and theater commands are Joint Operations Command Centers, or JOCs for short. It is through the JOCs that the CMC and theater commands exercise their defined authorities over subordinate units. The JOCs pull staff officers from various departments and offices from that command entity. For example, the CMC JOC pulls from the Joint Staff Department, Political Work Department, Logistics Support Department, etc. The JOC is organized into 4 broad elements: command, control and coordination, support, and political work. Each element is comprised of multiple groupings, such as the control and coordination element of an air operations group. Each group consists of a small number of specific seats that are manned by staff officers. Within a JOC, there can be a number of subcenters, such as the intelligence subcenter. Nested within theater JOCs are several functional command and control centers. The addition of control to the term command and control center likely indicates that these entities focus on centralized control authorities, whereas theater joint operations command centers focus on exercising operational command authorities. These are domain-centric ground, maritime, air, and conventional missile sub-command centers that are essentially the command elements from theater service components. These appear to be co-located with the theater service headquarters rather than the theater JOC, and are manned by staff officers drawn from the theater service headquarters. Everything we have just talked about covers how the PLA exercises C2 over most conventional operations. However, there are several unique cases that do not fall neatly into the structure we have just discussed. Let's now address these special case operations, namely nuclear, network, and space operations. We will discuss nuclear C2 issues in a dedicated video on the PLA's nuclear forces. But here's a brief overview of nuclear C2. Virtually all PLA sources state directly that the CMC retains the sole direct command authority over the PLA's nuclear forces. It is possible that the CCP's Politburo Standing Committee is somehow involved in the process, but no CCP or PLA document has overtly stated this. Upon the CMC issuing a warning order to PLA nuclear forces, nuclear launch and support units will begin the process of bringing China's nuclear arsenal into a state of readiness that allows the units to launch soon after the order is given. The CMC's issuing of a warning order is typically preconditioned on early warning that the adversary is on the brink of or has already used nuclear weapons. Once the CMC authorizes nuclear strikes, they will relay that command down the PLARF missile launch and support bases that exercise centralized control authorities over nuclear-related units. Or the CMC will reach down directly to those units, skipping the base command layer entirely. It is unclear what role the PLARF service headquarters plays in this process, although presumably it at least plays an advisory role to the CMC. The way that the PLA exercises C2 over network operations is extremely opaque. Although the PLA clearly intends for the creation of the PLA SSF to streamline C2 over such operations, they have never disclosed how exactly the system works. Our best understanding is based on the assessed role of various SSF Network Systems Department units, commonly known as the Cyberspace Force. Our best guess is that the primary operational command authority for network operations is a command element within the Network Systems Department. Let's call it a Network Operations Command Center. This command center is likely manned predominantly by Network Systems Department staff officers and reports directly to the CMC. Underneath this notional Network Operations Command Center likely exists several operations groups built around major CSF commands, specifically the Network Security Base and the Theater Technical Reconnaissance Bases. These bases presumably would have centralized control authorities over specific missions. Given that many of the CSF's high-end units belong to the Network Security Base, this is likely the primary offensive network operations group that oversees all strategic-level network operations. We don't know exactly what that might include, but offensive operations against network targets in the continental United States would likely qualify as a strategic network operation. The Network Security Base would exercise centralized control authorities over subordinate bureaus and offices, which in turn would execute the desired network operations. The Theater Technical Reconnaissance Bases, on the other hand, likely oversee network operations against the PRC's neighbors. The connection between the theater commands and the Theater Technical Reconnaissance Bases is unclear, but given the similar nomenclature and rough geographic alignment, the theater commands may have some ability to directly exercise centralized control authorities over the Theater Technical Reconnaissance Bases. However, the overarching Network Operations Command Center almost certainly retains a direct reach-down authority to task the Theater Technical Reconnaissance Bases with specific operations. Using a similar approach, we can try to decipher how the PLA exercises C2 over space operations as well. The SSF's Aerospace Systems Department, more commonly known as the Aerospace Force, would likely stand up a Space Operations Command Center. This entity, which almost certainly would report directly to the CMC, would act as a national command element that exercises operational command authorities over the PLA's space and counterspace operations. Underneath this element would be several operational groups built around major ASF commands. These operations groups would provide the bulk of the forces and exercise centralized control authorities over different types of space or counterspace operations. For example, the ASF's Base 36 would likely become one of the major counterspace operations groups that at least oversees the employment of higher-end counterspace jammers and directed energy weapons. Base 37, on the other hand, would act as an ISR operations group that is responsible for providing other space operations groups and the Space Operations Command Center with space situational awareness. Of course, there are some gray areas between the network and space domains. For example, do network operations intended to create effects in space fall under the purview of the Space or Network Operations Command Center? We have no good answers, but we can at least speculate. One possibility is that the PLA simply doesn't know itself. The PLA is a major advocate of trialing concepts in the operational force before settling on a specific concept. As of 2021, we know that the PLA split its strategic counterspace jammers in both parts of the SSF, so both the cyberspace and aerospace force have them. The PLA could be testing out what works best, having both components operate these capabilities, or only a single component. A second possibility is that the PLA assigns authorities based on effects. For example, the PLA wants the CSF to have counterspace jammers to degrade US space-based information networks, but also wants ASF to have counterspace jammers to degrade US space-based situational awareness assets. In both cases, the type of unit executing the operation is the same, but the target and desired effect is different. This is essentially the same argument for the Navy and Air Force both having fighters. Another possibility is that the C2 of such operations are based on unit function. This does not appear to be the case with the presence of counterspace jammers at both the CSF and ASF, but looking at the PLA's testing of cyber capabilities against Indian satellites, perhaps all network-related capabilities fall under the CSF, regardless of what domain the effects are created in. The PLA's C2 system may be complex, but it is not entirely unfamiliar. In typical fashion, the PLA has adopted many lessons learned by the United States in trying to develop its own joint command construct. Even before the full implementation of the Joint Theater Command System in 2016, the PLA had already, on paper, established a notional wartime command structure that strongly resembles what they have today in peacetime. As the PLA continues to modernize, we will see improvements to their C2 system as well. One should not necessarily expect things like decentralized control or mission command to become hallmarks of the system. As you probably recognize already from our discussion of the PLA's C2, they value centralization and control, and their modernization efforts will strive to improve those tenets. New technologies like machine learning, automation, and advanced computing will push the PLA's C2 system to become faster and more agile, but it will also push them to become even more centralized.